Now we're going to shift gears and begin to talk about the plant kingdom. The study of plants is called botany. And I'll be quite honest with you, I've always struggled a bit more talking about the study of plants as opposed to the study of animals, just because I'm less familiar in general with the biology of plants compared to the biology of animals. But I do understand certain things about plants, and one is that some of them will continue to live year after year. Those plants are called perennial plants, or perennial flowers if they have a flower. And those are to be compared with the annual plants, which live for a single year and then die. And there are actually plants who also will live for 2 years, and those are called biennial. So you have these three different durations of life. The perennials, things like roses, the annuals, the petunias are annuals, and then biennials, and quite honestly I can't think of an example of a biennial plant right now, but these various life cycles are different depending on the plant. Now you can separate the parts of a plant into those parts that are involved outside of reproduction. Those are called the vegetative parts of the plant, or the vegetative organs, and they include the roots, the stems, and the leaves, which we will talk about in this lecture today. And here's an example of the roots down here, the stem, and then the leaves here. And those are to be compared with the reproductive plant organs, which include flowers, fruits, and seeds. And these are all take part in a plant's reproduction. And here's the flowers with the production of pollen, which is the male aspect of the plant. And here's the female aspect with the stigma, where the pollen attaches and extends down to the ovary where the egg is, and then the fertilization occurs down here. And then there are certain cells related to the plant that are neither reproductive or vegetative. In fact, they have no specific specialized function, and those are called undifferentiated cells. Now, when you think about the types of tissues that you can find inside a plant, one is known as meristematic. And meristematic tissues are responsible for the reproduction of new organs and for healing. Ground tissue is all the tissue that does not belong to the vascular aspect of the plant or the dermal aspect of the plant. So you have ground tissue, which is primarily supportive tissue. Then the dermal aspect is on the outside of the plant, which much like the dermis and epidermis of the human skin, and protects the plant from water and various other insults from the environment. And then inside there are the vascular tissues, which we're going to talk about in more detail in just a minute. So to review, you have the meristematic tissues, which are not mentioned in this slide, which are responsible for forming the new tissues when that needs to be done. The dermal tissue, which is like, as it says here, like the skin of the plant. The vascular tissue, which are the arteries and veins, as it were, of the plant. And then the ground tissue, which is the supportive structures that stand between the vascular tissue and the dermal tissue. Now, when we look at the vascular tissue of a plant, they can essentially be separated into two types of vascular tissue. The first of these is called the xylem, and this shows the xylem on this side. The xylem is non-living, so it's very much like a conduit or a hose, and it's responsible for carrying water and dissolved minerals. And most of the direction here goes from the roots up into the rest of the plant, through the stems into the rest of the plant. The other tissue is called the phloem, and the phloem is living tissue, And unlike the xylem, in which most of the direction is from the roots to the stem, to the leaves and stems, the transportation in the phloem is in two directions because it carries sugars and organic substances throughout the plant, some of which are produced or absorbed from the roots and carried up, some of which are produced in the leaves and carried down. And so in these cases, you have to have two-way flow. And because there's two-way flow, you have these walls that are in between sections of the phloem, and there are perforations that allow for the transport of fluid across to the next section. Now, when we talk about leaves, this shows the structure of a leaf. We have the stem here, which is not part of the leaf, obviously. The attachment of the leaf to the stem is called the petiole. Then you have what's known as a midrib, which is a single stem-like structure, although I hesitate using that term, that goes up the approximate center of the leaf. This part of the leaf is called the blade, and then you have, branching off the midrib, you have veins that carry substances to and from the leaf. The tip is out here, and then this is a leaf bud. In deciduous trees, you'll see a lot of leaf buds because the leaves fall off each year, and then the bud produces a new leaf the next year. Now, this entire structure from here all the way up is a single leaf. So a simple leaf is you have a single petiole, a single blade, and one apex. A compound leaf contains many petioles, many blades, and many apices, and I'll show you an example of that in the near future here. The arrangement of leaves on the stem is what's known as the leaf mosaic, and there are three types of arrangements. There's the alternate arrangement, the opposite arrangement, and then what's known as the whorl arrangement. And here's an example of that. Here's the alternate arrangement, where you have a leaf here and then alternating on the other side and then on the other side like this. Opposite means that the two leaves are opposite to each other on the stem like this. And then whorl is when you have more than two at the same point and they branch off in several directions. Sometimes there are three, sometimes four or five. So these are the three different kinds of leaf mosaics, arrangements of leaves. Leaves can also have multiple different structures. These go from linear here all the way to something called chordate down here, and then everything in between. So you have a linear structure here. Here's an elliptical structure, ovoid structure, dentate with the sort of delta-looking shape, ovate, etc. Leaves are essentially classified by whether they're simple versus compound, whether they're arranged in an alternate, opposite, or whorled pattern, and then their shape, whether they have this kind of shape, one of these kinds of shapes. Now there's actually one other way in which leaves are differentiated, and that is the edging around the leaf. You can see here is the serrated edge. This is the entire, it's called entire. Crenate means that it has this sort of bumpy structure. Lobed means you have individual sort of lobe-looking parts. And then parted, which is like lobed, only much more distinct parts, like that. And then the last part that's used to differentiate various kinds of leaves is the pattern of veins in the leaf. Here you have the pinnate pattern, where you have the midrib goes up the middle. Then you have the branches coming off at various points along the way. This is frequently compared to palmate, in which you have no single midrib, but several branches that start at the junction of the petiole to the blade and form various branches out from that. Then you have this parallel structure like this, which is sort of the opposite of this, and then the arcuate structure, which looks somewhat like the Jewish candle of David here. All of these different leaf aspects are used to characterize the leaves that various plants produce. Now, one of the things that controls the type of leaves that are produced is whether or not the seed has 2 cotyledons or 1. A cotyledon is a seed leaf, and here's an example of a seed with a single cotyledon, and it's called a monocot. Here the seed has 2 seed leaves, so it's a dicot or 2. The veins in a monocot plant, a plant that has a single cotyledon, are generally parallel, whereas in the dicot they tend to be branching like this with a network. So they can be, if we look back at our types, they can be pinnate, they can be palmate or arcuate, but they tend to have this sort of branched or network-like structure, whereas the veins on a monocot are parallel like this. When you look at the vascular bundles in the stem, in a dicot, you have a ring that goes around the outside, and this is where the vascular bundle is, right here. So all the vessels are in this part. This tissue in here is ground tissue. This tissue on the outside is ground tissue. And this ring represents the vascular tissue. Compared to monocots, where the vascular tissue is sort of dispersed throughout. Each of these little dark sections here represents a vascular bundle. Monocots have a fibrous root system, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Dicots have a taproot system with a single large root that burrows deep into the ground and then branches off of that single taproot. The flowers, they have petals that generally come in multiples of either 4 or 5. This one has 5 petals. The monocots have multiples of 3. This is actually 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is a multiple of 3. So make sure you get a good look at this slide and go over it, because one of my favorite quiz questions is to ask to compare these sorts of aspects between a monocot and a dicot. When we look at the leaf structure microscopically, you have 4 layers. You have an epidural layer. You have the palisade mesophyll here, which is tightly packed. You have the spongy mesophyll, which is loosely packed. And then you have another epidural layer on the bottom. This is the top part of the leaf up here, and this is the bottom part of the leaf down here. And down here we have what are little openings that are called stoma. And these stoma are surrounded by guard cells. There's 2 guard cells here. And the guard cells are responsible for controlling the size of this opening. And the opening allows for CO2 to enter the leaf and for oxygen to leave. It also allows water to leave, depending on the water situation in the plant. This spongy area generally has air in here as well as moisture. And then here's one of our vascular bundles with the xylem and phloem that are present. And generally this part up here is the xylem, or excuse me, the phloem, and this is the xylem. These parallel lines represent the xylem. The outside of the leaf is covered with a waxy substance. This waxy substance primarily acts as a waterproofing material, and it's called cuticle. As I said, the stomata, that's the plural, stoma is singular, are the holes that allow for the escape of water and gas as well as the intake of water and gas. The size of these is controlled by guard cells. And what happens is when these cells become filled with water, so in a situation where a plant has a lot of water, they swell and they cut the hole off so that it's less likely to allow water to escape. On the other hand, if there's I'm sorry, it's the other way. When they swell, the hole actually gets bigger and allows more water to escape. When they are smaller, they pinch together and they let less water escape. When we talk about leaf color, the green color you see is obviously chlorophyll. As the chlorophyll goes away, underneath the chlorophyll are these various other pigments. And the the orange-yellow pigment are carotenoids, and the red-blue pigment are the anthocyanins. And so when the chlorophyll goes away, you get, depending on what is in the background, you get either the red-blue sort of situation here or the orange-yellow situation on this side. The structures in the leaves that hold these sorts of pigments are called plastids, and the carotenoids are present in all the leaves even when they look green, and it's the disappearance of chlorophyll that allows for these other colors to come through. And as I said, the anthocyanins are in this area with red, pink, orangey kind of pigment on this side. So we have deciduous trees, which are trees that lose their leaves in winter, and the petiole attaches the leaf to the stem here, and there's something called an abscission layer. And the abscission layer is responsible, it's at the base of the petiole, and it's responsible, at some point it cuts off the attachment and allows the leaf to fall off. And when it falls off, this bud here is present, and it allows for a new leaf to sprout out the next spring. When leaves fall to the ground, they tend to turn brown, and the brown color comes from a chemical known as tannic acid, or tannins.